Millions of Americans grew up hearing family legends about native ancestors or ancient African journeys across the Atlantic. But scientists now reveal a truth few expect. Nearly 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships, and only 388,000 ever disembarked in what became the United States. That means the vast majority of Black Americans' roots trace to just 4 coastal African regions, not the stories most were told. As DNA timelines and ship ledgers rewrite the picture, the real origins and the consequences are far more complex than the myths. So how did these ancestors actually arrive, and what secrets has history hidden in plain sight? 12.5 million men, women, and children were forced onto slave ships bound for the Americas between 1517 and 1867. The ledgers kept by ship captains and merchants record the numbers in stark detail. As the vessels crossed the Atlantic, disease, starvation, and violence claimed the lives of nearly 1 in 7, about 1.8 million people lost before reaching any shore. Of those who survived the Middle Passage, most did not arrive in what is now the United States. Brazil received nearly 5 million. The Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, Cuba, and Saint Domingue, took in another 4.7 million. The United States, by comparison, received only about 388,000, barely 3.5% of the total. This small fraction would become the foundation of generations of Black families in America. The numbers are not estimates scribbled after the fact. They are captured in rows and columns of shipping logs, insurance records, and port documents, each entry a life uprooted and accounted for in the business of human trafficking. The historian's ledger line stands as undeniable proof. For every person who stepped onto American soil, dozens more were sent elsewhere or did not survive the journey at all. The scale of the trade was global, but the impact in North America was shaped by this disproportion. The story of Black American origins begins with this narrow channel, a few 100,000 arrivals set against a backdrop of millions forced across the ocean. Only by understanding this imbalance can the next chapter where those ships sailed from come into focus. The story of Black Americans does not begin with a vague reference to a distant continent. Ship manifests and port records name the coasts where most captives were taken: Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bights of Benin and Biafra, and Congo and Angola. Each region carried its own languages, beliefs, and family networks torn apart at the water's edge. In Senegambia, traders targeted the Mandinka, Wolof, and Fula, funneling thousands through the island outposts of Gori and San Louis. The Gold Coast, home to the Akan peoples, saw its castles, Elmina and Cape Coast, become holding pens for those bound for the Americas. Farther east, the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra became the main departure points for Yoruba, Fon, and Igbo captives, loaded at ports like Ouidah and Boni. Southward, the rivers and estuaries of Congo and Angola supplied ships with men and women from the Congo and Mbundu kingdoms, funneled through Luanda and Cabinda. These 4 corridors, Senegambia, Gold Coast, the Bights of Benin and Biafra, and Congo and Angola, accounted for the overwhelming majority of Africans forced onto ships bound for the New World. The routes were not random. European demand, local wars, and shifting alliances shaped who was captured and where they embarked. Over time, the coastal forts and trading posts became the final stop on African soil for millions. Today, these embarkation zones are reflected in the genetic signatures found in African American families, deep traces of the regions where the journey began. The forced migration was not a single story, but a map of named places and peoples, each with its own history, now woven into the fabric of Black America. Charleston, South Carolina became the main gateway for enslaved Africans entering what would become the United States. From 1670 through the federal ban in January 1808, nearly 186,000 men, women, and children were offloaded at its docks, almost half of all those brought directly to North America. The city ledgers catalog names, ages, and African origins in cramped handwriting, each line a record of forced arrival. The low country plantations, with their rice fields and tidal rivers, absorbed thousands, shaping the region's language, foodways, and family lines for generations. But the story did not end at the water's edge. In January 1808, Congress outlawed the importation of enslaved people from overseas, closing the Atlantic pipeline but leaving slavery itself untouched. Demand for labor in the expanding cotton and sugar frontiers of the Deep South only grew. The result was a massive forced migration within the country. Over the next 6 decades, an estimated 1 million enslaved people were uprooted from the Upper South, from Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, and marched in coffles or shipped by river and sea to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Slave traders kept meticulous manifests for coastwise voyages, listing names, ages, and the ports of departure and arrival. These documents, now preserved in archives, track the breakup of families and the redistribution of kin across hundreds of miles. In the Low Country, elders still recall stories of ancestors whose names appear in these records, some sold south as children and never seen again. In the Upper South, descendants trace family lines fractured by sale, with oral histories echoing the pain of separation. The domestic slave trade, unleashed after 1808, did not simply move bodies, it scattered roots, reshaping the genetic and cultural map of Black America. The legacy of Charleston's manifests and the coastwise ledgers is written into family trees that span states and generations, setting the stage for the genetic patterns that researchers are only now beginning to fully decode. A modern geneticist sits at a table covered in family trees and test reports. She points to the numbers that have become the new baseline for understanding Black American ancestry. On average, self-identified African Americans carry about 73% African ancestry, 24% European, and less than 1% Native American. The numbers come from large-scale studies, tens of thousands of DNA samples mapped across the country. But averages only tell part of the story. About 22% of Black Americans have at least 1% Native American ancestry, but for most, that signal is too small to detect. The national mean for Native ancestry remains under 1%, a fraction that challenges the stories many families have passed down for generations. A genealogist explains that, while some families, especially those in Oklahoma or parts of the Southwest, do show higher Native ancestry, most results are shaped by centuries-old patterns, not recent or widespread mixing. She points out that DNA tests have their limits. Small fractions can fall below the threshold of detection, and reference panels for Native American ancestry are less complete than those for African or European origins. This means that, for many, the stories of a Cherokee grandmother or a Seminole ancestor may be rooted more in family legend than in the genetic record. An Oklahoma participant, holding a printout of her DNA results, reacts with quiet surprise. She grew up hearing that her great-grandmother was full-blooded Choctaw, but the test shows no detectable Native ancestry. The genealogist reassures her that this is common. Oral tradition often preserves fragments of history, but DNA can only confirm what has survived through the generations and what current science can measure. These results are not a verdict on identity, but a snapshot of inherited genes. The data, drawn from thousands of people across the country, reveal a pattern. The vast majority of Black Americans' ancestry traces back to West and West Central Africa, with a significant European component and only a small, regionally variable Native American fraction. The numbers set the stage for understanding how and when these ancestries combined. Geneticists studying African American ancestry noticed a puzzle in the numbers. The overall ancestry averages are about 3/4 African, 1/4 European, but those averages tell only part of the story. When researchers compared the X chromosome, which is inherited differently in men and women, to the rest of the genome, a pattern stood out. There was more African ancestry on the X chromosome than on the other chromosomes, and more European ancestry on the rest. This difference is not random. It reflects who, in the past, contributed which ancestry and under what circumstances. The explanation comes down to biology and history. The X chromosome is passed down twice as often by women as by men. If European men, but not European women, fathered children with African women, the European ancestry would show up more on the non-sex chromosomes, and African ancestry would dominate the X. That is exactly what the data show. A lead population geneticist put it plainly: the patterns of sex-biased admixture in African Americans directly reflect the legal and violent power structures of slavery, not consensual mixing. This genetic fingerprint is visible across the country. In every major study, the European ancestry in African Americans is disproportionately paternal, carried on the Y chromosome, and passed from father to son. The maternal lines, traced through mitochondrial DNA, remain overwhelmingly African. The imbalance is not subtle. In many regions, up to 4 out of 5 European ancestors in African American family trees were men. The historical record matches the genetic evidence. Laws in slave societies gave white men near total control over the bodies and lives of enslaved women, and violence or coercion was common. The sex-biased pattern in the DNA is a direct legacy of that power. These findings are not just numbers, they are a record of suffering, survival, and the realities of slavery written into the genome itself. Geneticists can read the timeline of ancestry in the DNA of Black Americans, using the genome as a kind of clock. When scientists date the mixing of African, European, and Native American ancestries, the results point to 2 main windows. The earliest mixing between European and Native American ancestors happened about 12 generations ago, roughly 3 centuries back, in the early days of colonial America. The major wave of African and European genetic mixing came later, about 6 generations ago, placing it in the late colonial period and the era of legal slavery. These dates match what ship manifests and historical records show. The vast majority of genetic blending happened after the founding of the English colonies, not in some distant undocumented past. The tools behind these findings are precise but not perfect. By comparing how chunks of DNA are shuffled and broken up with each new generation, researchers can estimate when different ancestries entered a family tree. The method is not exact down to the year, but the broad pattern is clear. The story is colonial, not ancient. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mother to child, carries a different signature than the Y chromosome, which travels from father to son. Among Black Americans, maternal lineages are overwhelmingly African. In large studies, more than 90% of mitochondrial DNA matches African L clades, signals that trace back to women from Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bights of Benin and Biafra, and Congo, Angola. The Y chromosome, by contrast, shows a stronger European presence. In some regions, up to 1/3 of paternal lines are European in origin. This contrast is not random. It reflects the realities of slavery, where African women and European men were forced into unequal relationships, often through violence or coercion. Geneticists caution that DNA can only measure what is present and what current science can detect. Small fractions of ancestry may go undetected, and reference panels for some African regions remain incomplete. But the overall pattern, maternal lines rooted in Africa, paternal lines with more European input, and admixture dates clustered in the colonial era, holds across the country. The genetic record, like the paper trail of ship manifests and sale ledgers, anchors the origins of Black America to a specific time and place. In July 1860, the schooner Clotilda slipped quietly into Mobile Bay, carrying 110 captives taken from Ouida on the coast of present-day Benin. There was no official manifest filed with customs. The voyage was illegal long after the United States had banned the importation of enslaved Africans. But the names and stories survived in other ways. Court records, affidavits, and interviews preserve the identities of a handful: Oluwale Kosola, later known as Kujo Lewis; Abache, called Clara Turner; and Radoshi, known as Sally Smith. Their descendants still live in the Mobile area, some in Africa Town, the community founded by Clotilda survivors after emancipation. One descendant, tracing her family through oral history and local records, describes reading her ancestor's name in a faded deposition. "It's proof we were not erased. We have a name, a place, a story." Each time a family consents to share their lineage, it is a decision weighed with care. The connection between archive and living memory is fragile, built on trust, and on the right to claim one's own story. Between 1910 and 1970, 6 million Black Americans left the rural South in a movement that spanned generations. Entire families boarded trains bound for Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, and dozens of other cities. The routes they followed traced the lines of the nation's railroads and highways: Illinois Central to the Midwest, Pennsylvania Railroad to the Northeast, Southern Pacific to California. Job bulletins and word of mouth mapped out corridors of opportunity, while racial violence and Jim Crow laws pushed people to seek new lives elsewhere. This migration did more than shift addresses. It rewired the genetic map of Black America. Today, researchers can track the imprint of those journeys in DNA. Genetic clusters match the old migration routes, connecting people in Harlem to roots in Georgia or linking Chicago families to Mississippi towns. The legacy of the Great Migration lives on in the way ancestry is distributed across the country. Regional differences in genetic makeup, shaped by where families settled, who they married, and what communities formed, still echo the choices made during those decades of movement. Inherited conditions rooted in the distant past continue to shape the health of Black Americans today. Sickle cell disease, a genetic adaptation once protective against malaria in West Africa, now affects 1 in every 365 Black children born in the United States. The carrier trait is even more common, about 1 in 13. These numbers are not just statistics. They represent families navigating a diagnosis that can bring pain, stigma, and medical challenges. A physician specializing in hematology explains, "Sickle cell is not a disease of race, but of ancestry. Its presence in African American communities reflects a survival strategy from centuries ago." Another inherited trait, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, known as G6PD deficiency, affects roughly 1 in 10 Black American males. The gene is carried on the X chromosome, which means men are more likely to be affected, while women are often carriers. G6. PD deficiency can trigger dangerous reactions to certain foods or medications, a vulnerability that traces back to the same regions in West and Central Africa where many Black Americans' ancestors lived. These conditions are reminders that the forced migration of millions left not only cultural and familial marks, but also a genetic legacy that continues to matter in clinics and hospitals across the country. Today, every DNA test and census reveals a living mosaic, one shaped by forced migration, violence, and resilience. As genetic data rewrites old myths, the story of Black American origins is no longer rumor, but record. Identity, once fractured by power, now finds clarity in evidence. The facts remain. History leaves a mark, and the search for belonging continues, written in our blood, carried forward with every generation.